I am your host, Nero Wolfe. Let's begin our journey.
It was a Monday morning, and the world outside the brownstone was behaving with its usual lack of consideration for a man's peace of mind. The mid-morning sun was hitting the West 35th Street pavement, making the city smell like a mix of hot asphalt and wet newspaper. I was at my desk in the office, checking the bank balance and wondering if I should tell Fritz that the mailman looked like he was coming down with something that might be contagious when the house phone buzzed. This wasn't the usual come-up chime. It was the sharp, insistent ring that meant the gears of the universe had hit a snag in the plant rooms. It was on the top floor. Wolfe's voice, usually a controlled rumble that suggests a volcano in a state of quiet contemplation, sounded like a tectonic plate shift in the middle of a very bad mood. Archie, come up, immediately. When Wolfe says immediately, he doesn't mean after you finish typing a sentence, or after you've adjusted your tie, or after you've checked the weather. He means before the sound of his voice has finished vibrating in the receiver. I took the elevator to the roof, where the air turns tropical and the humidity hits you like a warm, wet blanket. I found Wolfe in the middle room, standing over a bench of odontoglossums, as if he were officiating at a funeral for a head of state. Theodore Horstman, the plant nurse, who usually looks like he's ready to fight anyone with a watering can, was nearby, looking like he was ready to start throwing heavy ceramic pots. "Look," Wolfe commanded, pointing a massive finger that looked like it was made of granite. I looked. One of the prize hybridsa plant that Wolfe had spent 3 years cobbling with tenderness of a mother bird looked like it had spent the night in a blast furnace. The leaves were yellowed and curled at the edges, and the roots had turned a sickly, translucent grey. It wasn't just a sick plant, it was a dead one, and it had died with a speed that suggested it hadn't been an accident of nature. "Black rot?" I asked, though I knew the answer. Black rot does not strike with such surgical precision. "No," Wolfe snapped, his eyes narrowed to slits that barely showed the amber light. "Herbicide. A concentrated systemic toxin has been introduced into the nutrient tanks for this specific bench. This was not a failure of biology, Archie. It was a calculated intrusion. It was an act of malice directed not just at a plant, but at the logic of this house. Wolfe's plant rooms are his sanctuary, a place where the chaos of the city and the folly of man are supposed to be kept at bay by 3 inches of reinforced glass and a very strict schedule. For someone to sneak a poison into those tanks was more than a crime, it was a personal desecration. I waited for the explosion, the shouting, the demands for the police, the general upheaval of the brownstone's atmosphere, but Wolfe was surprisingly quiet. He just stood there, his 1/7 of a ton bulk, casting a long, heavy shadow over the dying orchids. It's the quiet that tells you someone is about to be dismantled. "Who was up here yesterday?" he asked, his voice dropping into that melodic, dangerous tone he uses when he's already decided someone is going to be buried in the paperwork of their own undoing. "The committee from the Manhattan Botanical Society," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "You let them in for the annual inspection. There were 4 of them. I stayed in the office to handle the bills, but Theodore was here the whole time." "Theodore was in the potting room for exactly 12 minutes, Wolfe remarked, looking at Horstman, who suddenly found a bag of osmunda fiber. "Very interesting. 12 minutes is all it takes for a vial to be emptied and a heart to be broken. Archie, I want their names, I want their dossiers, and I want them here this afternoon. Not as guests, not as colleagues, but as respondents to a charge of botanical sabotage." "You're taking the case?" I asked, though it was a stupid question. "There's no client, Wolfe, unless you want to pay yourself, which I think violates a few laws of the Internal Revenue Service. The plant is the client," Wolfe said, turning away from the bench with a sudden, surprising grace that defied his mass. "Someone has violated the sanctity of this house to strike at a creature that cannot defend itself. They have mistaken my seclusion for vulnerability. That is an intellectual challenge I will not ignore." I headed back down to the office, my mind already running through the roster of the Manhattan Botanical Society. It was a collection of high society horticulturists, professional rivals, and people who took their petals very seriously. In that world, a rare hybrid is worth more than a reputation, and a well-placed drop of poison can settle a decade-long grudge. If one of them had brought a bottle of toxin into Wolfe's glass kingdom, They were about to find out that the man in the yellow vest had a much more lethal sting than any orchid. I reached for the phone and started dialing. The poison in the orchid room was officially open, and for the first time in a long time, the case was personal. Wolfe was already in his chair by the time I sat down, and the way he was staring at the wall told me he wasn't thinking about lunch. He was thinking about revenge, and in this house, revenge is always served with a side of cold, hard logic. The doorbell rang at precisely 4 o'clock, which was the first sign that the people I had summoned were either very nervous or very respectful of Nero Wolfe's temper. In this house, 4 o'clock is usually a sacred hour, when Wolfe is finishing his afternoon session with the orchids and preparing to descend for the serious business of doing nothing until dinner. By the time I had ushered the 4 members of the Manhattan Botanical Society into the office, the air was already thick with the smell of wet wool and the kind of defensive posturing that usually precedes a grand jury investigation. Wolfe entered a few minutes later. He didn't walk, he moved like a slow-motion avalanche, settling into the oversized chair behind his desk with a grunt that could have meant anything from good afternoon to I hope you brought your lawyers. He didn't look at the guests. He spent a good 30 seconds adjusting his blotter, his massive hands moving with a precision that always makes me think of a surgeon or a safecracker. When he finally looked up, his eyes were narrowed to those amber slits that signify he stopped being a botanist and started being a predator. The invasion of the glass house was now a matter of record. The suspects were arranged in a semicircle of red leather chairs. On the far left was Dr. Aris Thornino, relation to the composer from my last case, but just as prickly. He was a small, bird-like man who ran a rival greenhouse in Westchester and had once described Wolfe's odontoglossums as technically proficient but emotionally cold. Beside him was Evelyn Vance, a society widow whose bank account was as large as her hat, which currently featured enough plumage to start a bird sanctuary. Then there was Marcus Venates, a popular name in these stories, apparently a professional judge who had denied Wolfe the gold medal at the last flower show. Finally, there was Julian Gray, a younger man with a nervous twitch in his left eye and a reputation for being a progressive hybridizer. "I have brought you here," Wolfe began, his voice dropping into that low, melodic rumble that usually makes people want to check their pockets for missing items, not to discuss the upcoming spring exhibition, but to discuss a desecration. Yesterday, during your visit to my plant rooms, a systemic herbicide was introduced into nutrient tank number 4. A unique hybrid, the result of 3 years of meticulous labor, is now a corpse. The room went dead silent. Dr. Thorne was the first to break it, his voice a high, thin red. A tragedy, certainly, Wolfe. But to call us here as if we were common criminals? Really, plants die. It's their nature. Not when they are murdered, Wolfe snapped. The toxin used was a specific chemical compound, a concentrated glyphosate derivative that is not sold to the general public. It requires a commercial license and a specific knowledge of botanical physiology to administer without destroying the entire bench. The person who did this didn't want a massacre, they wanted a specific execution. Evelyn Vance adjusted her pearls, her face a mask of practiced boredom. "My dear Mr. Wolfe, we were all in the room together. Theodore was watching us. Unless one of us possesses the ability to turn invisible, I fail to see how such a feat could be accomplished." "Theodore was in the potting room for 12 minutes, Wolfe remarked, his eyes moving from face to face with the speed of a camera shutter. 12 minutes is an eternity for a practiced hand. One of you brought a vial. One of you waited for the moment the nurse's back was turned, and one of you poured the end of a 3-year dream into a tank of water." Marcus Vane leaned forward, his expression one of judicial gravity. "This is a serious accusation, Wolfe. Without proof, you are merely venting your grief. I suggest you look to your own staff before you insult your peers." Wolfe didn't answer. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers interlaced over his middle, the tap-tap-tap of his thumbs being the only sound in the office. This was the moment the brownstone felt truly disturbed. It wasn't just that outsiders were in the room. It was that the logic of the sanctuary had been breached. Wolfe looks at his orchids as an extension of his own mind, and to poison them was to poison the one part of his life that was supposed to be perfect. "Proof, Mr. Vane, is a commodity I intend to manufacture," Wolfe said, his voice dropping into a register of cold finality. "Archie, you will take their coats. I want them examined for any traces of the chemical. And while you are doing that, I want you to check the guest book from the Westchester show. I find that malice is often preceded by a public disagreement. The 4 suspects looked at me like I was a publican. I stood by the door, my hand on the brass knob, feeling the tension vibrating in the hallway. The invasion was complete. The office was now a battleground, and the weapon of choice was a drop of poison in a glass of water. As I led them back toward the hall, I saw Julian Gray's hand tremble as he reached for his hat. It was a small thing, a footnote in the narrative. But in this house, a footnote is often the most important part of the page. Wolfe remained in his chair, a massive yellow-vested sphinx. He wasn't thinking about the coats, and he wasn't thinking about the show. He was thinking about the tank, and I knew that by the time dinner was served, someone in that group was going to wish they had stayed in Westchester. By the time the 4 suspects had been ushered out of the brownstone, the office felt as though it had been scrubbed with lye. The air was thin, and Wolfe sat behind his desk with his eyes closed, his breathing so shallow that he might have been an oversized yellow silk cushion. I knew the signs. He was cataloguing the pollinated rivals, arranging them in his mind not by their social standing or their botanical degrees, but by the specific gravity of their envy. I didn't need a magnifying glass to see the motives. They were as bright as the neon signs in Times Square. I sat at my desk and pulled out the notes I had scribbled while the delegation was still under the lights. First, there was Dr. Aris Thorne. He was a man who lived in the shadow of Wolfe's success. 3 years ago, at the International Orchid Congress, Wolfe had debuted a hybrid that had made Thorne's lifelong work look like a collection of dandelions. Thorne had stood on the podium and called Wolfe's methods unscientific sorcery. He didn't just want the orchid dead, he wanted the sorcerer discredited. To a man like Thorne, a dead odontoglossum was a victory for the rational world, or at least for his version of it. Then there was Evelyn Vance. Her motive was more complicated, which usually means it's more expensive. She had been trying to buy the very plant that had been poisoned for over a year. She wanted it for her conservatory in Newport, not because she loved the flowers, but because she loved the idea of owning something Nero Wolfe wouldn't sell. A woman who is used to getting everything she wants finds no to be a very bitter pill, or in this case, a very bitter drop of herbicide. If she couldn't own it, she would ensure that no one else could, especially the man who had dared to refuse her checkbook. Marcus Vane, the judge, was another race. He wasn't a grower, he was an arbiter, but he was an arbiter with a reputation for being bought, not with cash, but with prestige. Rumor had it that he was up for the presidency of the National Horticultural League, and Wolfe's refusal to acknowledge Vane's authority was a thorn in his side. Vane had written an article in the Quarterly Review suggesting that Wolfe's private collection should be seized by the state for scientific preservation. Sabotaging the collection was a way to prove that Wolfe couldn't protect his own treasures, making the case for seizure that much stronger. Finally, there was Julian Gray. He was the dark horse, a young, brilliant hybridizer who had once been a student of Theodore Horstman. He had a chip on his shoulder the size of a greenhouse. He believed that the old guardmen like Wolfe were stifling innovation by hoarding rare genetic material. Gray had been seen hanging behind the brownstone 2 weeks ago. When I had mentioned it to him in the office, his left eye had started twitching like a telegraph key. He wanted the orchid's DNA, and if he couldn't have a cutting, he would settle for the destruction of a rival's masterpiece. Wolfe opened his eyes and looked at me. The motives are clear, Archie. They are the usual collection of human frailties, pride, greed, and the resentment of excellence. But we are looking for a specific opportunity. Who among them was nearest to tank number 4 when Theodore went into the potting room? Theodore says they were all in the middle room, I said, leaning back in my chair. Dr. Thorne was examining the Phalaenopsis, Mrs. Vance was looking at her reflection in the glass. Vane was checking the thermometers. And Julian Gray? He was standing right next to the nutrient tanks, looking at the plumbing as if he were planning to install his own. And the coats? Wolfe prompted. I checked them while they were in the hall, I said. Nothing in the pockets but gloves and handkerchiefs. But Thorne's sleeve had a faint, oily stain near the cuff. It didn't smell like dirt. It smelled like a laboratory. Wolfe's fingers began to tap, tap, tap against the arms of his chair, a stained cuff and a twitching eye. It is a beginning, but it is not a conclusion. We are dealing with someone who understands that in this house, the most effective weapon is the one that leaves no fingerprints. The poison was introduced through the water system, meaning the perpetrator knew exactly how the circulation worked. They didn't just pour it into the pot, they poured it into the heart of the machine. The brownstone was silent, but the tension was building. The pollinated rivals were out there in the city, thinking they had left their secret behind in a tank of dying water. But they had forgotten that Nero Wolfe doesn't need a witness when he has a motive and a map of the plumbing. "Archie," Wolfe said, standing up with a sudden, surprising grace, "go to Julian Gray's laboratory in Long Island City. I want a sample of the herbicide he uses for his progressive experiments, and while you are there, find out if he has been communicating with Marcus Vane. I find that when a judge and a thief are in the same room, they usually have a contract." I reached for my hat. The legwork was starting, and the streets of New York were about to get a lot more interesting. The Orchid was dead, but the case was just beginning to bloom. The drive to Long Island City was a journey from the cultivated silence of West 35th Street into a landscape of industrial grit and the smell of roasting coffee from a nearby factory. Julian Gray's laboratory was tucked into a converted warehouse that looked like it had been designed by someone who hated windows. I parked the Heron at a slant across the street and spent a moment watching the front entrance. Gray was supposed to be the future of horticulture, but the neighborhood suggested he was working on a shoestring budget, which is exactly the kind of environment where ethics start to look like an expensive hobby. I didn't bother with the front door, I used the service entrance, which was held open by a crate of empty glass carboys. Inside, the air was a sharp, chemical cocktail that made the back of my throat itch. It was a far cry from the humid, floral sweetness of Wolfe's glass house. This was where nature was dissected and rearranged under fluorescent lights. I found Gray in the back, hunched over a microscope with the kind of intensity usually reserved for diamond cutters or safecrackers. "Afternoon," I said, leaning against a steel table covered in Petri dishes. The door was open, so I figured I'd let myself in and save you the walk. "Nice place you've got here. A bit heavy on the fumes, but I guess that's the price of progress." Gray jumped so hard he nearly knocked the microscope onto the floor. His left eye started that telegraph key twitch again, faster than it had been in the office. "Goodwin, what are you doing here? This is private property. I am in the middle of a delicate sequence." "It'll be quick," I promised, approaching a shelf of brown glass bottles. Mr. Wolfe is a bit of a stickler for details. He was wondering if you'd mind sharing a small sample of that new systemic herbicide you've been bragging about in the journals, one that targets root structures without affecting the bloom. He's thinking of upgrading his own maintenance routine, and he likes to test the competition. Gray's face went the color of a blanched almond. He moved to block the shelf, his hands trembling. "I don't use systemics in this lab. My work is purely genetic, and even if I did, the formula is proprietary. Tell Mr. Wolfe he can read about it when I patent it." "Proprietary," I repeated, letting my gaze drift to a small, unlabeled vial sitting next to a stack of shipping manifests. "That's a big word for a small bottle. You know, it's a funny thing about those nutrient tanks back at the brownstone. They were hit by something very specific, something that doesn't just kill, it executes. It takes a certain kind of mind to appreciate that kind of precision, a progressive mind." I didn't wait for him to answer. I reached out and snagged one of the shipping manifests. Gray made a move for it, but I've had plenty of practice dodging people who are a lot more coordinated than a nervous hybridizer. The manifesto was delivered 3 days ago. The sender was Vane Chemicals Sapliessa's subsidiary of the same Marcus Vane, who had been judging Wolfe's plants with such judicial severity. "Well, look at that," I mused, tucking the paper into my pocket. "A joint venture. Vane provides the chemicals, and you provide the application. It's a beautiful partnership, Julian, very modern. I am sure the district attorney will appreciate the efficiency of it all." "You have no right to take that," Gray hissed, his voice cracking. "It's a business transaction. It has nothing to do with Wolfe's plants." "Maybe," I said, heading for the service door. "But I find that when a judge starts supplying the weapons, the verdict is usually in the bag." "I'll be seeing you, Julian. Try to get some air. The fumes are clearly making you jumpy." I spent the next 2 hours on the pavements, tracing the link between Marcus Vane and the Long Island City lab. It wasn't hard. Vane wasn't just a judge, he was a silent partner in Gray's operation. He was bankrolling the progressive experiments, hoping to find a shortcut to the kind of prestige Wolfe had earned through 40 years of patience. The poisoned orchid wasn't just a casualty of envy, it was a hurdle that had been removed to clear the way for their own market entry. By the time I headed back across the Queensborough Bridge, the sun was dipping below the skyline, painting the city in shades of orange and soot. I had the manifest, I had the connection, and I had the smell of Gray's lab still clinging to my suitor smell that was identical to the residue ID found on the sleeve of Dr. Aris Thorne back at the office. The petals were falling, and the pattern was starting to emerge. When I walked back into the brownstone, the house was silent, but the smell of Fritz Lamrago was wafting through the Huller sign that the world was still turning, even if the glass house was under siege. I went straight to the office. Wolfe was in his chair, a book on his lap, but he wasn't reading, he was waiting. The pavements were productive. "Wolfe," I said, dropping the shipping manifest onto his desk. "Julian Gray and Marcus Vane are in business together. Vane provides the chemicals, and Gray provides the lab. And ID bet a week's salary that the stain on Dr. Thorne's cuff came from a meeting in that very lab. They aren't just rivals, they are a syndicate." Wolfe picked up the manifest, his eyes glowing with a cold, predatory light. "A syndicate of the mediocre, Archie. They have mistaken the destruction of my work for the creation of their own. It is a common error among those who lack the talent to build, but they have made one tactical mistake." "Only one?" I asked. "They have assumed that I would look for the poisoner among the visitors," Wolfe said, his voice dropping into a register of quiet, lethal focus. "But the poison was introduced through the nutrient tanks, and to do that, one needs more than a 12-minute window. One needs a key. The petals and pavements had led me back to the brownstone." As I looked at Wolfe, I realized the case wasn't just personal anymore. It was internal. The office was illuminated by the soft golden glow of the desk lamps, but the light didn't reach the corners of the room where the shadows seemed to be congregating. Wolfe sat as still as a mountain, his fingers interlaced over his middle, watching the smoke from my cigarette curl toward the ceiling. I had just finished explaining the connection between Marcus Vane's chemical supply company and Julian Gray's laboratory. It was a neat package, tied with a ribbon of corporate greed, but Wolfe didn't look satisfied. He looked like a man who had found a fly in his soup and was deciding whether to call the waiter or the health department. The subtle trespass didn't announce itself with a broken window or a locked lock. In this house, disruptions are much trickier. I noticed it when I went to the small cabinet behind Wolfe's desk to pull a file on a previous botanical case. The cabinet contains the records of every hybrid Wolfe has ever registered, cross-indexed with the specific potting mixtures and nutrient schedules used by Theodore. It's a room within a room, a paper sanctuary of Wolfe's intellectual property. The file for the Odontoglossum hybrid 1 currently dying upstairs was exactly where it should have been, but the small burlap sack of Osmunda fiber that Theodore keeps on the bottom shelf for emergency repotting had been moved. More importantly, it had been opened. A small trail of the dark, wiry fern root was scattered across the floorboards like a line of spilled tea. To anyone else, it was a minor mess. To me, knowing Theodore's obsession with order, it was a scream in a library. "The Osmunda is missing, Wolfe," I said, pointing to the shelf. "About a handful's worth, and whoever took it wasn't interested in the fiber. They were interested in what was tucked inside the bag." Wolfe's eyes snapped open. He knew exactly what I was talking about. Theodore, being a man of high-grade paranoia, had a habit of hiding the keys to the nutrient tank locks inside that specific bag of fiber whenever the delegations came through the house. He didn't trust the desk drawers, and he didn't trust his own pockets. He trusted the dirt. "So the 12-minute window wasn't the only opportunity," I continued, pacing the length of the rug. "Someone knew about Theodore's hiding spot. They didn't need to sneak a vial into the tanks while he was in the potting room. They just needed to grab the key, make a copy, and return it. The poison could have been planted at any time last night, this morning, or even during the middle of the night if they had a way into the house." "A copy of the key," Wolfe murmured, his voice dropping into that register of quiet, lethal focus. "And who, Archie, among our pollinated rivals, has spent enough time in this house to know the habits of a plant nurse who has been here for 20 years. Julian Gray, I said, the name hitting the air like a lead weight. He was Theodore's student. He lived in this house for 6 months in 38. He knows the routines, he knows the locks, and he knows Theodore thinks a dirt bag is as safe as a vault. He didn't just trespass in the glass house, he trespassed in the office. He came in here while the others were distracting Theodore upstairs. The violation felt personal now. It wasn't just about a dead plant, it was about the fact that someone had stood in this very room, right where I was standing, and picked a lock on our privacy. Wolfe's face was a granite mask. He takes the sanctity of the brownstone more seriously than most people take their religious vows. To have a former student use the house's own habits against it was a betrayal that went beyond professional rivalry. "Check the kitchen," Archie, Wolfe commanded, his voice as sharp as a scalpel. "I want to know if Fritz noticed any displacement in the pantry. If they were in the office, they were likely in the hallway. And if they were in the hallway, they had access to the basement." I went to the kitchen, where Fritz was busy reducing a sauce with the kind of focus that usually prevents him from noticing anything short of an explosion. But Fritz has a memory for the geography of his kitchen that rivals Wolfe's memory for a Latin route. I asked him about the secondary entrance one that leads from the service alley into the basement. "The bolt was thrown, Archie," Fritz said, his brow furrowing as he looked at the door. "But this morning, when I went to take in the milk, I found a small piece of metal on the floor. I thought it was a part of the delivery crate, so I put it in the bin. I fished it out. It wasn't a piece of a crate. It was a tiny, jagged shard of brass, the kind that breaks off when a key is forced into a lock that isn't quite ready for it. The trespass was no longer subtle, it was documented. Someone had been in the house, they had used a copied key, and they had left a piece of their arrogance behind. I went back to the office and dropped the brass shard onto Wolfe's blotter. "Thea not just killing your orchids, Wolfe. Thea moving in. Julian Gray didn't just use the chemical from Vane, he used the key he made while he was a guest in this house. The subtle trespass was the rehearsal. The poison was the performance." Wolfe took the shard with a pair of silver tweezers. He looked at it for a long time, his eyes glowing with a cold, predatory light. "They have made a mistake, Archie. They have assumed that because I am sedentary, I am also stagnant. They have used the past to strike at the present. It is time we show them that the present has teeth." He reached for the house phone and buzzed the plant rooms. "Theodore, the odontoglossum is to be moved to the basement vault, immediately. And Archie, call Saul Panzer. I want him to find the locksmith Julian Gray used in Long Island City. I want the original mold for that key. We are going to provide Mr. Gray and Mr. Vane with a new kind of nutrient, one that they will find very difficult to swallow." The office was silent again, but it was the silence of a predator waiting in the tall grass. The missing Osmunda and the brass shard had given us the map. Now, all we needed was the bait. The shadows in the potting room were always longer than they had any right to be, even at high noon, but with the sun dipping below the horizon, they stretched across the slate floors like reaching fingers. I had spent the last hour following Wolfe's instructions, which involved a lot of crouching in the damp corners of the basement and moving with a silence that would have made a cat look clumsy. The plant rooms were directly above us, a glass and steel crown on top of the brownstone, but the potting room, the engine room of Wolfe's botanical obsession was where the true mechanics of the crime were being processed. Wolfe had sent me here to wait. "The intruder has already tasted success, Archie," he had said, his voice a low vibration in the office. "Success is a narcotic for the mediocre. Having poisoned the odontoglossum, they will return to ensure the evidence of their method, contaminated nutrient reservoir, is purged before we can conduct a chemical analysis. They will expect Theodore to be at dinner. They will expect me to be in my chair. They will not expect you." I wasn't in the potting room itself. I was tucked into the narrow alcove where the spare bags of charcoal and potting soil are kept. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the sharp, metallic tang of the copper sprayers. I had a clear view of the secondary service door, the one where Fritz had found the brass shard. For 40 minutes, the only sound was the rhythmic hum of the furnace and the occasional groan of the old house as it settled into the night. Then there was a new sound. It wasn't the bolt moving, it was the soft, persistent rasp of a key being eased into a lock that had been recently oiled. The door swung open, and a shadow loosed from the gloom of the service alley. It moved with a familiarity that chilled me. It didn't hesitate or fumble. It walked straight to the nutrient filtration system, a complex array of glass tubes and brass valves that kept the lifeblood of the plant rooms circulating. The figure reached into a pocket and pulled out a small, dark objector wrench, by the look of it. They weren't there to poison anything else. They were there to detach the primary filter, the one that held the residue of the herbicide. I stepped out of the alcove just as the figure began to apply pressure to the brass fitting. I didn't pull my gun, but I made sure the light from my flash hit them square in the eyes. A bit late for a plumbing repair, isn't it? Mr. Gray. Julian Gray didn't scream. He froze, the wrench still gripped in his hand, his face looking like a death mask in the harsh beam of the flashlight. His left eye wasn't just twitching now, it was practically dancing. He looked at me, then at the door, then back at the nutrient tank. He was trapped between a lie and a hard place. "Goodwin," he whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. I realized ID left a personal item in the potting room yesterday. I didn't want to disturb Mr. Wolfe's dinner. "A personal item?" I asked, moving closer so I could see the sweat beading on his upper lip. Is that what we're calling a systemic herbicide these days? Or maybe the personal item is the copy of the key you made when you were Theodore's star pupil. You know, Wolfe is a lot of things: a glutton, a snob, and a man who refuses to leave his house, but he isn't a fool. He knew Yao'd come back for the filter. Gray dropped the wrench. It hit the slate floor with a heavy final clang. It wasn't just me. Vane. He told me the Orchid would have died anyway. He said Wolfe was holding back progress. We needed those genetic markers for the new project. If Wolfe wouldn't sell, we had to make the plant a loss for him. It was supposed to be a trade-off. A trade-off with a bottle of poison, I noted. That's a funny way of doing business, even in Long Island City. But you see, Julian, you've hit a snag. The filter you were about to remove isn't the one from the odontoglossum tank. That one is already upstairs in the office, being examined by a man from the police lab who thinks herbicide is a very interesting subject for a midnight conversation. It was a lie. Wolfe was the lab, and the man from the police was just a figment of my imagination, designed to keep Gray from running, but it worked. Gray slumped against the potting bench, all the progressive arrogance draining out of him. He looked like what he was, a scared kid who had let a greedy judge talk him into a felony. The shadow in the potting room had been captured, but the increased pressure wasn't over. I knew Marcus Vane was still out there, probably waiting in a car at the end of the alley, watching the clock and wondering why his partner was taking so long with the plumbing. I marched Gray toward the service stairs, the heavy weight of his betrayal filling the narrow passage. When we entered the office, Wolfe was in his chair, a glass of beer in his hand and a look of monumental boredom on his face. He didn't look at Gray, he looked at the brass shard on his blotter. Saul Panzer was standing by the window, his hat in his hand, looking like he'd just come from a long walk in a very specific neighborhood. "The shadow has a name, Wolfe," I said, pushing Gray into the red leather chair. And it turns out the judge provided the wrench and the chemical. We caught him trying to purge the filtration system. Wolfe took a slow, deliberate sip of his beer. "A shadow, Archie, is merely the absence of light. Mr. Gray has been living in a shadow of his own making for a very long time. It is time we turned on the lamps." He looked at Julian Gray then, and for a second I almost felt sorry for the kid. Wolfe's eyes weren't angry, they were disappointed, which is much worse. "Julian, you were taught in this house that the study of life requires a reverence for the living. You have used that knowledge to become an architect of death. Tell me, did Marcus Vane promise you a medal, or merely a laboratory?" The interrogation was starting, but the final germination was still to come. I reached for the house phone. It was time to invite the judge to the office for a final verdict. The office was no longer a sanctuary, it had become a trap, baited with the wreckage of a 3-year dream and the cold, hard logic of a man who did not believe in accidents. Julian Gray sat in the red leather chair, his face the color of the parchment he used for his lab notes, while Saul Panzer stood by the door with the quiet, immovable presence of a stone wall. Wolfe sat behind his desk, his eyes half closed, his fingers moving in that rhythmic, silent dance against the arms of his chair. He was no longer a botanist, mourning a loss. He was a conductor, preparing for the final, discordant movement of a symphony he had already scored. "The hybrid's trap," Archie Wolfe said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that seemed to fill every corner of the room, "is not a matter of cross-pollination. It is a matter of cross-examination. We have the apprentice who provided the access, the chemist who provided the toxin, and the judge who provided the motive, but we lack the catalyst. We lack the reason why a man like Marcus Vane would risk his judicial robes for a handful of wilted petals." I sat at my desk, the shipping manifest from Long Island City spread out before me like a map of a battlefield. "Vane isn't just a silent partner in the lab, Wolfe. Saul found out that the National Horticultural League is about to announce the new standard of excellence for the Odontoglossum class. If your hybrid lived, it would have set a bar so high that Vane's own Entrisand Julian's progressive experiments would have been disqualified as inferior. They didn't just want to win, they wanted to ensure you weren't even in the race. A monopoly of the mediocre," Wolfe remarked, his eyes opening to thin amber slits. "They have mistaken my orchids for mere commodities. They have assumed that because I am a man of appetites, I am also a man of prices." Archie, the phone. "It is time to summon the arbiter of our fate." I reached for the receiver and dialed the private number for Marcus Vane. When he answered, his voice was thick with the gravel of a man who had spent the evening waiting for a call that hadn't come. I told him that Julian Gray was in our office, that a serious mechanical failure had occurred in the potting room, and that Mr. Wolfe felt it was only proper for the chairman of the league to be present for the final disposition of the evidence. I didn't mention the wrench, and I didn't mention Saul Panzer. I let the silence on the other end do the work. "He's coming," I said, hanging up, "and he's bringing his indignation with him." He sounded like a man who was already preparing his opening statement for the defense. "Indignation is the last refuge of the exposed," Archie Wolfe said, leaning back in his chair. "He will arrive believing that he can still manage the narrative. He will expect a negotiation. He will find a verdict." While we waited, the air in the office grew heavy with the smell of Gray's fear and the lingering scent of Fritz's cooking. Wolfe had ordered the Odontoglossum moved from the basement vault back to the office. It sat on a small mahogany stand in the center of the rug, a pathetic, shriveled thing that looked like it had been carved from yellow wax. It was the physical embodiment of the trespass, a silent witness that Wolfe intended to make speak. The doorbell rang at 9:14 p.m. I let Marcus Vane in, and he marched into the office as if he were entering a courtroom where he was the only one allowed to speak. He was in evening dress, his white tie perfectly straight, his face a mask of judicial severity. He didn't look at Julian Gray, and he didn't look at the dying plant. He looked straight at Wolfe. "This is an outrage, Wolfe," Vane barked, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "To drag me out on a night like this because your assistant has found a leak in your plumbing. If Gray is here, it is because he is a concerned colleague. I will not have his reputation mind-smeared by your paranoid fantasies." "Sit down, Mr. Vane," Wolfe said, his voice dropping into a register of cold, hard focus. "You are not here as a judge. You are here as a supplier. I have on my desk a manifest for a shipment of glyphosate derivatives sent from your chemical company to Mr. Gray's laboratory 3 days ago. I also have a shard of brass from a key that was forced into my service door key that Mr. Gray was caught using less than an hour ago in a desperate attempt to purge my filtration system." Vane didn't sit. He stiffened, his eyes darting to the manifest, then to Julian Gray, who was now staring at the floor as if he hoped it would open and swallow him. The hybrid's trap had been sprung, but the judge was a man who had spent a lifetime navigating the loopholes of the law. "A chemical shipment is a matter of business, not a crime," Vane said, his voice trembling slightly. "And if Gray was in your basement, it was a trespass of curiosity, nothing more. You have no proof that any of this is linked to that. That weed on the rug." Wolfe leaned forward, his massive hands resting on the edge of the desk. "The proof, Mr. Vane, is not in the chemical. It is a hybrid. You see, the plant you poisoned was not the Odontoglossum you saw during the inspection. That plant was moved to my bedroom 3 days ago. The one sitting before you is a common, worthless variety that I prepared specifically for your arrival. I knew you would return to finish the job. I knew you couldn't resist the urge to ensure that Nero Wolfe was truly defeated. The silence that followed was so absolute you could have heard a petal fall. Marcus Vane looked at the dying plant, then at Wolfe, and I saw the first cracks of genuine terror appear in his judicial mask. The trap wasn't just about the poison, it was about the vanity of the poisoner. You baited me, Vane whispered. No, Mr. Vane, Wolfe said, his eyes glowing with a fierce intellectual light. I merely provided the environment for your nature to bloom. Archie, the lights. It is time for the final germination. The office was suddenly plunged into a dramatic, high-contrast clarity as I flipped the switches for the overhead banks. The shadows retreated to the very edges of the bookshelves, leaving Marcus Vane standing in the center of the rug like a man caught in a spotlight during a botched burglary. The dying orchid on the stand seemed to shrink under the glare, its yellowed leaves a stark indictment of the man in the white tie. Julian Gray was slumped so far into the red leather chair I thought he might eventually disappear into the upholstery. Saul Panzer remained by the door, a silent, unblinking sentinel who looked like he'd seen this show before and was just waiting for the curtain to fall. Wolfe sat in his throne, his face a mask of granite illuminated by the harsh light. He didn't look like a man who had lost a prize, he looked like a man who had found a flaw in a diamond and was about to split it wide open. The final germination was no longer about the life of a flower, it was about the death of a reputation. Wolfe leaned forward, his massive hands flat on the blotter, his amber eyes fixed on Marcus Vane with a predatory intensity that made the judge's judicial robes seem like paper-thin armor. The germination of a lie, Mr. Vane, requires a very specific climate, Wolfe began, his voice dropping into that low, melodic rumble that vibrates the very air in the room. It requires the dampness of envy and the heat of unearned ambition. You believed that by utilizing a systemic toxin and a compromised apprentice, you could prune the competition to suit your own stature. You assumed that my devotion to my plants made me blind to the mechanics of their destruction. It was a failure of the imagination's same failure that has prevented you from ever producing a hybrid of true merit. Vane tried to summon his dignity, pulling at his lapels, but the gesture was hollow. This is the theatre, Wolfe. Pure, unadulterated theatre. You've produced a dying weed and a shipping manifest that proves nothing more than a commercial transaction. If Julian Gray was in your basement, he acted alone. I am a judge of the league, a standing man. Your trap is nothing but a collection of coincidences and spite. Is it? Wolfe asked, his voice rising just a fraction, a sound like a distant cannon. Let us look at the weed more closely. Archie, the magnifying glass. I stepped forward and handed the large lens to Wolfe. He didn't use it on the plant. He held it over a small glass vial that had been sitting behind his beer bottle, a vial I had retrieved from Julian Gray's pocket when Wed marched him up from the basement. Inside the vial was a clear, oily liquid that caught alight like a malevolent jewel. This, Wolfe said, is the residue from the primary filter of the nutrient tank filter Mr. Gray was so desperate to remove. It is not merely glyphosate. It is a specific experimental isomer that Julian Gray described in a paper he wrote for your company's private research journal last August. It is a chemical signature as unique as a fingerprint. And since your company is the only licensed producer of this isomer in the state of New York, the line of culpability does not merely touch you. Mr. Vane begins and ends with you. Vane's face went from the color of an oyster to the color of a winter sidewalk. He looked at Gray, his eyes wide with a frantic, silent command to stay quiet, but the kid was already broken. Julian looked up, his left eye twitching so violently he had to squint to see. He told me it wouldn't be traced, Gray shouted, his voice cracking into a high, thin wail. He said the filter would catch the synthetic markers and we'd replace it before the tests were run. He said Wolfe was an old man who wouldn't know the difference between rot and poison. I didn't want to kill the odontoglossum. I just wanted the genetic data from the root tips. Vane was the one who said the plant had to go. He said as long as the Wolfe standard existed, the League would never look at our work. There it is, I noted, leaning against the edge of my desk. The final germination, greed for the lab and vanity for the judge. It's a classic cross-pollination of the worst traits in the business. Wolfe didn't look triumphant. He looked disgusted. He leaned back in his chair, the springs groaning under the weight of his judgment. You have used your position, Mr. Vane, to sabotage the work you were sworn to protect. You have suborned a young man's talent and turned it into a weapon for your own petty advancement. You are not a judge of the League, you are a blight upon it. Archie, the phone. Who are we calling? I asked, my hand already on the receiver. Cramer or the League headquarters? Both, Wolfe snapped. But first, call the Manhattan Botanical Society. I want the chairman to know that the gold medal for the Odontoglossum class will not be awarded to a poisoner, and then call Inspector Cramer, telling him a trespassing charge is the least of Mr. Vane's worries. We have a case of criminal mischief and corporate sabotage that will keep the district attorney busy until the next century. The office was silent again, but it was the silence of a grave. Marcus Vane slumped into the second red leather chair, his white tie finally going crooked, the judge of the League reduced to a man who had gambled his life for a flower and lost everything to a man who lived in a chair. Wolfe picked up his beer and took a slow, deliberate sip, his eyes never leaving the shriveled plant on the rug. The germination was complete. The lie had bloomed, and the frost had finally arrived to kill it. Archie, Wolfe said, his voice dropping back into its normal, businesslike tone. After you've made the calls, tell Fritz that the dinner I missed while attending to this nonsense should be kept warm. I find that the exposure of judicial fraud gives me a remarkably keen appetite for lamb. I started dialing. The final germination was over, and the brownstone was about to return to its sacred silence. But I knew that for Marcus Vane and Julian Gray, the winter was just beginning. The office felt like oxygen had been replaced by a heavy, invisible fog of disappointment. Inspector Cramer had arrived with his usual retinue of weary-eyed detectives, their arrival signaled by the sharp, rhythmic rapping on the front door that always sounds like a demand for immediate surrender. They had taken Julian Gray and Marcus Vane into custody, a process that involved a lot of official muttering and the metallic jingle of handcuffs, a sound that always seems particularly jarring in a room filled with leather-bound books and the scent of old beer. Vane had tried to maintain his judicial dignity until the very end, but by the time they reached the hallway, he looked like a man who had suddenly realized that his life's work had been written in disappearing ink. Now, it was just Wolfe, the shriveled plant, and me. The cross-pollination of lies had been untangled, but the room still felt haunted by the debris of the confrontation. Wolfe sat in his chair, his eyes fixed on the shriveled weed in the center of the rug. He looked like a general surveying a battlefield after the smoke had cleared, finding the victory to be a messy, distasteful business. The dying plant was a physical record of the lengths to which a small mind will go to feel large, a testament to the fact that even in the refined world of horticulture, the roots of malice run deep. The absurdity of it, Archie, Wolfe said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate the very floorboards. To strike at a plant, a creature of grace and silence, governed by nothing but the laws of biology and the care of its keeper. Mr. Vane believed that by destroying the manifestation of my success, he could absorb its prestige. He did not realize that a hybrid is not a trophy to be stolen, it is a thought made manifest. One cannot kill a thought with glyphosate. I sat at my desk, pulling a fresh sheet of paper into the typewriter to begin the formal report. It's a ritual that helps me clear my head, the clicking of the keys acting as a rhythmic antidote to the lingering tension of the evening. He was a judge who couldn't stand being judged, Wolfe. That's the oldest lie in the book, the one where you think the robe makes the man. He and Gray were cross-pollinating their worst instincts. Gray wanted the shortcut to fame, and Vane wanted the shortcut to power. They ended up with a shortcut to Sing Sing. It was a failure of the intellect, Archie. A systemic failure. They utilized the mechanics of the housed nutrient tanks, the potting room, the very schedules that provide our order to facilitate their intrusion. They assumed that because my life is a series of routines, I have become a part of the machinery. They forgot that the architect of a routine is the only one who truly understands its vulnerabilities. Wolfe reached out and touched the shriveled leaf of the decoy plant with the tip of his finger. He didn't do it with the tenderness of a nurse, he did it with the cold, clinical respect of a victor acknowledging a fallen foe. The true hybrid, the Odontoglossum that they so desperately sought to erase, is currently flourishing in my bedroom. It is oblivious to the drama that has unfolded in its name. It will be shown at the exhibition, and it will be awarded the medal it deserves, but the triumph will be hollow. The sanctity of the glass house has been breached, and that is a stain that no award can cleanse. The house phone buzzed, a sharp, domestic sound that cut through the philosophical gloom. It was Theodore calling from the top floor. He had spent the last 2 hours conducting a frantic audit of the other nutrient tanks, checking every valve and filter for signs of a secondary strike. I could hear his high, nervous voice, even from across the desk. "Everything is clear, Theodore," I said into the receiver. "The shadow has been removed and the plumbing is back to being just plumbing. Go get some sleep. The master wants the real odontoglossum brought back down at 8 tomorrow morning." I hung up and looked at Wolfe. He was staring at the brass shard on his blotter, the small piece of the service door lock that had been the final nail in Marcus Vane's coffin. "You knew Julian would come back for the filter, didn't you? That's why you had me waiting in the basement." "It wasn't just a hunch. It was a necessity, Archie. A man like Julian Gray, trained by Theodore, would never be able to live with the knowledge that his signature remained in a filtration system. He is an ego technician. He needed to be the one who cleaned the slate. His vanity was his greatest vulnerability, and I merely provided the mirror." Wolfe stood up, his massive frame blocking out the light from the desk lamp for a moment. He walked over to the globe and gave it a small, decisive spin, watching the continents blur into a single grey smear of geography. "The lies have been resolved, Archie. The cross-pollination has been pruned. The brownstone is once again a house of logic, though it smells quite strongly of the streets. Tell Fritz that the missed dinner is to be served in the dining room in 10 minutes. I find that the resolution of a botanical tragedy leaves me with a remarkably sharp appetite for something substantial. The lamb, Archie, and a fresh bottle of beer. I watched him leave the room, the yellow silk of his vest shimmering in the shadows of the hallway. The case was closed, the suspects were in the hands of the law, and the real Orchid was safe in the master's bedroom. I turned back to my typewriter, the keys clicking away in the silence, recording the final draft of a mystery that had started with a drop of poison and ended with a verdict of absolute clarity. The cross-pollination of lies was over, and for Nero Wolfe, that was the only bloom that truly mattered. The dining room was a pool of warm, civilized light amidst the sprawling shadows of the brownstone. The heavy oak table, polished to a mirror finish by Fritz's tireless hands, reflected the soft glow of the candles and the deep, rich amber of the beer in Wolfe's glass. Outside, the city of New York was still grinding its gears, shouting its frustrations into the cold night air. But inside, the world had been reduced to the essential elements of survival: quietude, sustenance, and the rhythmic clink of silver against fine porcelain. Nero Wolfe sat at the head of the table, his massive shoulders squared, his attention entirely focused on the plate of braised lamb and the accompanying side of brassica dish of roasted cabbage with a sharp, mustard seed reduction that Fritz had perfected over a decade. Wolfe did not speak during the first 20 minutes of a meal. It was a rule as immutable as the laws of thermodynamics. He approached his food with the same intellectual precision he applied to a locked room mystery, dissecting each flavor with the reverence of a scholar. I sat opposite him, enjoying my own portion but keeping one eye on the clock. The events of the afternoon and evening, the poison, the stakeout in the potting room, the judicial meltdown of Marcus Vane felt like a fever dream that was rapidly cooling. The beer and brassica of the aftermath was the grounding reality we both needed. It was the palate cleanser for the soul. When Wolfe finally reached for his napkin and performed the slow, deliberate wipe of his mouth that signaled the conclusion of the main course, he leaned back in his chair. The springs groaned, a familiar and almost comforting sound in the quiet room. He looked at the half-empty bottle of beer before him and then at me. His eyes were no longer narrow and predatory, they were clear, reflecting a mind that had finally purged itself of the day's botanical filth. "The brassica, Archie," Wolfe remarked, his voice a contented rumble. "It is a member of the mustard family, a hardy and resilient genus. It thrives in conditions that would wither a more delicate creature. It does not pretend to be an orchid. It does not seek to dominate the garden with a manufactured prestige. It simply is. There is a profound ethic in its simplicity." I took a sip of my coffee, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. I guess Marcus Vane could have learned a thing or two from a cabbage then. He spent so much time trying to be the rarest bloom in the league that he forgot how to just be a decent human being. He wanted the prestige without the dirt, and in the end, all he got was the dirt. Prestige, Archie, is a shadow cast by excellence. To seek the shadow while ignoring the object that casts it is the primary folly of the mediocre. Mr. Vane and Mr. Grey were so enamored with the image of success that they were willing to poison the reality of it. They believed that by eliminating the standard, they would become the standard. It is a logical fallacy that has sustained the egos of charlatans since the dawn of history. Wolfe reached for his beer, pouring the last of the bottle into his glass with a steady, practiced hand. They have been removed from the garden. The League will purge their names, the district attorney will archive their crimes, and the orchids upstairs will continue to grow, indifferent to the fact that their existence was the pivot for a judicial collapse. It is a satisfactory conclusion. Satisfactory for us, I said, leaning back and stretching my legs. But I have a feeling the Manhattan Botanical Society is going to be a bit twitchy for the next few years. They are going to be checking their nutrient tanks every time someone sneezes near a flower show. You've turned a hobby into a high-security risk, Wolfe. Horticulture has always been a high-security risk, Archie. Anything worth creating is worth protecting. The mistake was in assuming that the threat would always come from the outside, from a blight or a pest. We forgot that the most dangerous parasite is the one that shares the same taxonomy as the host, the one that smiles at the inspection and carries the vial in its cuff. Wolfe looked toward the window, where the reflection of the candlelight danced against the dark glass. He was already moving on, his mind shifting away from the poison and back toward the rhythmic, orderly life of the brownstone. Tomorrow, the odontoglossum will be returned to its place of honor. Tomorrow, Theodore would be back to grumbling about the humidity levels. Tomorrow, the world will be as it should be, Archie, Wolfe said, his voice dropping into a register of quiet, reflective finality. Tomorrow morning, I want the front door lock serviced. Not because I suspect another intrusion, but because I find the sound of a forced key to be a particularly offensive memory. I want the house to sound as it did before Mr. Grey decided to play the role of the plumber. I'll call the locksmith first thing, I promised, and I'll make sure he doesn't have any ties to Vane Chemical Supplies. Wolfe stood up, his massive frame dominating the room for a moment before he turned toward the door. Good. And Archie... Tell Fritz the mustard seed reduction was acceptable. Not perfect. Mind you, the acidity was a fraction too high, but acceptable for a day that has been so thoroughly compromised by the sourness of man's ambition. I watched him walk out, the yellow silk of his vest catching the last of the candlelight. He was heading for the elevator, for a final check of the plants before bed. I stayed in the dining room for a moment longer, listening to the silence. The mystery was over, the beer was gone, and the brassica had done its job. I reached for my hat on the side table, feeling the weight of the day finally lift. Acceptable, I murmured to the empty room, a quip forming in my mind that I knew I'd save for the morning. In this house, that's practically a standing ovation. I blew out the candles and followed the master into the quiet dark of the hallway. The brownstone was a sanctuary again, and for now, that was more than enough.